Wow, what a day. I've learned so much, and thank you to the organizers, congratulations, and to all of the speakers. The poet Rumi said, the wise trade in their cleverness to upgrade to bewilderment. So I am bewildered by all these wonderful thoughts that I've had, and I invite you to think about a problem that I have been trying to sort out. And that is about what happens to these kinds of results after we've created them. What happens next? I don't have a lot of answers, but I do have some interesting questions for you, perhaps. How many of you really hope that the results from your research are used by decision makers to do good things, right? That's what we're after. That's what we aspire to. Well, how does scale matter for that process? And this is something that I've been wrestling with for a long time, with my career playing out at that interface between academia and the public sector decision makers and the public society, people who are making these decisions, are a special set of actors. And there's a lot of different examples that I could use for this, and the article that we published on it had everything ranging from heat in Arizona to water in Kansas, and fracking in Texas. This is actually an image of fracking fields in Denton, where I want to use this as a thought experiment. How would you scale and frame this study? The county of Denton finally got tired of seeing these effects of fracking in their water in their community, so the county banned fracking. Okay? Well, what is that going to do? Not 200 days later, the state of Texas passed HB 40 that said, counties, you cannot do that. You can't ban fracking in your counties. So how would you set this research up to try to understand the environmental effects of the water pollution, the earthquakes that are happening across this scale, the political and social dimensions of the decision making around how do you decide what is happening in what spaces? Who has jurisdiction, and most importantly, who is accountable for these decisions? So I want to be inspired. Go back to basics. We've heard about MALP. This is where I started thinking about this. Of course, this is highly relevant where you might think of this area A. You would come up with one answer to that question, and if you change slightly the way that you were drawing those boundaries, maybe not the county, you might get different answers, right? But I want to remind ourselves that the very real classic example of the MALP is gerrymandering, and very real decisions get made on the basis of those results. Changes elections, changes outcomes, changes who are those decision makers and how they are held accountable just by the decisions of how you are creating that scale. So it's a methodological issue in the sense that it's a frame-dependent issue. And what we're looking at is who draws those boundaries. That is the focus of agency. That is the power in this decision. The risk of not paying attention to this kind of a problem, as we've heard, the conclusions are drawn prematurely, results are made to retrofit or justify a priori decisions, as in gerrymandering, and many, many others that we've heard a lot about today. But that doesn't quite satisfy me in thinking that this is going to explain all of those problems. So fortunately, a couple of years ago, May-Po Kwan came out with this really interesting work about defining another type of problem that is the uncertain geographic context problem, which I think applies to many of the studies that we've seen today, which you obviously know the unit of analysis, like let's say this area B that you're looking at, there are many influences that come in and out through that space over time. So if you're looking at the classic example of air quality on human health, in your study area, the air moves through that. People move in and out if they're commuting, they're moving in and out of that space. So it creates sort of this uncertainty, and there's some interesting things that have to do with how do you make decisions then about that space. So the focus of agency then gets shifted a little bit, but we can bring into the picture who is being studied. What are their spatial behaviors? How are they moving through this? But the risk of not paying attention to this particular problem is that you might miss the important context, right? You might be uncertain about what is happening. Maybe you're omitting some phenomena that you should be taking into account, and the temporal movement might be ignored through that area of interest. But I think there's one more piece of this puzzle that, as responsible researchers, I would just challenge you to think about this additional sort of dimension of this kind of problem that might affect some of us. And that is about what happens to that research after we create those results. And I call it the decision, accountability, spatial incongruence problem. Kind of a mouthful, but you might think of it like this. You're studying an area C. That is the jurisdiction by which a decision is being made, maybe the county. That's in the black box. Well, that decision can impact people differently. That is the red box. Sometimes it affects people within that jurisdiction. Sometimes it affects people without. Maybe it affects people differently and not everyone in your jurisdiction. But then there is this accountability issue, and that is what is represented there in the blue box. There are influences over which the decision makers make those decisions that can happen at many different scales in many different locations that may not have anything to do with, that may be incongruent with the jurisdiction, with the space of the impact and the scale of the impact, and beyond. So in the case of fracking, obviously, the contaminated water doesn't just stay within one particular jurisdiction, but the influence of other actors on the decision-making process goes beyond the county, beyond the state, and needs to be taken into account. If we're going to study this problem, we need to think about all of those different scales and tying back up those decisions and the accountability for those decisions. So in other words, I'm hoping that formulating the problem in this way, we might look about that incongruence across jurisdictions, across the impacts, and who are accountable for those decisions, who are affected by decisions, and who makes those decisions, not just us as researchers, and then the relationship among all of those. And what is our responsibility in when we frame our studies and we draw those scales to incorporate this kind of agency? If we don't pay attention to that, I think some of the risks that we might want to think about are drawing conclusions without consideration of all of the individuals who might be affected by a particular decision, accountability for the anticipated consequences that fall outside of the area of interest or the time frame of the study, and holding our decision makers accountable for these decisions, holding ourselves accountable for the results of our research.